The grand mansion was filled with laughter and chatter, but in one corner stood Amara, the quiet maid who never dared to speak above a whisper. She had always kept her head down, blending into the background, invisible to everyone, until that day. The millionaire's mother stormed into the living room, her eyes burning with fury. With one swift motion, she ripped Amara's uniform apart in front of the entire household, accusing her of something unspeakable. Gasps echoed as fabric fell to the marble floor, leaving Amara humiliated and trembling. But what no one expected was what happened next. When the millionaire himself walked in and saw the scene, his reaction would silence the entire mansion. Forever. The sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city gleamed like a crown under the midday sun. It was the kind of home that drew admiration and envy. Marble floors polished to perfection, chandeliers dripping with crystals, and hallways so vast they seemed to swallow footsteps. Behind its grandeur, however, lay a world of silent struggles and unspoken judgments. Amara had worked here for almost 6 months. She was the kind of maid most employers claim to want, quiet, obedient, and efficient. Her ebony skin glowed against the crisp white of her uniform, and her dark curls were always tucked neatly under a headscarf. She never spoke unless spoken to, and carried herself with the humility of someone who knew the consequences of standing out. To Amara, this job was more than a paycheck. It was survival. She had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were as scarce as clean water. Her father had died when she was young, leaving her mother to raise 3 children on her own. Amara, being the eldest, had dropped out of school to work as soon as she turned 16. She had scrubbed floors in cheap motels, washed dishes in noisy restaurants, and endured the sneers of strangers who saw her only as the help. But this job was different, or so she thought. The millionaire's mansion promised stability, decent pay, and perhaps even kindness. At first it seemed true. The family barely noticed her presence, which was a blessing in its own way. The only person who spoke to her with more than a passing glance was the millionaire's son, Ethan. Unlike his mother, who exuded superiority in every gesture, Ethan was approachable, even warm. He greeted her politely, thanked her when she brought his coffee, and sometimes left generous tips tucked under the saucer. It wasn't much, but to Amara, those small gestures were lifelines of dignity in a world determined to strip her of it. The mother, however, was another story. Margaret Sinclair was a woman who carried herself like royalty. Her world revolved around image, status, and control. Every detail of the mansion bore her stamp of perfection, and she expected the same flawlessness from those who served her. To her, maids weren't people. They were moving parts of a machine designed to keep her empire gleaming. From the beginning, Margaret made it clear that Amara didn't belong, not in her home, not in her world. She never shouted. Her cruelty was quiet, deliberate. A raised eyebrow when Amara entered a room, a pointed glance at a speck of dust that wasn't there, a lingering stare at the way her uniform hugged her frame, all of it designed to remind her of her place. Amara endured it. She had to. Each paycheck meant food on the table for her siblings, school fees for her little brother, and medicine for her ailing mother. She told herself that dignity could bend without breaking. That silence was strength. Then came the party, the beginning of the end. Margaret had been planning the event for weeks, an exclusive gathering for the city's elite, a showcase of wealth and influence. The guest list read like a who's who of high society, CEOs, politicians, celebrities, all eager to bask in the Sinclair glow. The mansion buzzed with activity. Florists arranged roses in towering crystal vases, caterers lined the kitchens with trays of hors d'oeuvres, and a string quartet rehearsed in the grand hall. For Amara, it meant endless work. She polished silverware until her hands ached, ironed table linens until the fabric shone, and ensured that every glass sparkled under the chandeliers. She moved through the chaos with her usual quiet efficiency, unnoticed, unacknowledged, just the way Margaret liked it. But that night, something shifted. As guests arrived in sleek black cars and shimmering gowns, Amara stationed herself near the dining room, ready to refill glasses and clear plates. She kept her gaze low, her steps light, but she couldn't ignore the way conversations faltered when she passed. Wealthy women leaned closer to whisper. Men cast lingering looks that made her stomach knot. It wasn't the first time she had felt eyes on her, but tonight the stares carried a different weight, one heavy with judgment and speculation. The whispers grew louder as the evening unfolded. Amara didn't know why until she overheard a fragment of conversation near the staircase. "Ethan, the maid. Have you noticed?" Her chest tightened. They were talking about Ethan, about her. She shook her head, willing the words away, but the seed was planted. Someone had noticed his kindness, misread it, and turned it into scandal. By the time dessert was served, the air was thick with tension. Margaret's smile was brittle, her laughter sharp, and her eyes followed Amara like a predator, tracking prey. Amara avoided her gaze, focusing on the empty glasses, the crumbs on plates, the tiny details that kept her grounded. But deep down, she knew something was coming. When the last guest departed and the echo of heels faded down the marble steps, silence settled over the mansion like a shroud. Amara exhaled, her body aching from hours on her feet. She thought she could slip away to her quarters, shed her uniform, and rest. She was wrong. Margaret was waiting. She stood in the center of the living room, framed by the glow of the chandelier, her figure tall and imposing. In her eyes burned a rage Amara had never seen before, a cold, simmering fury masked behind an elegant smile. The room was empty except for them, but the weight of that stare made it feel crowded. "Amara," Margaret said softly, though the sweetness in her tone was poison. "Come here." Amara obeyed. She always obeyed. Her steps were slow, hesitant, each one echoing in the vast silence. Her heart pounded, her palms slick with sweat. Margaret's gaze swept over her, from the headscarf to the polished shoes, lingering on the curve of her waist, as if her very existence were an affront. Then, with a suddenness that stole Amara's breath, Margaret reached forward and tore the front of her uniform open. The sound of ripping fabric sliced through the silence like a scream. Amara froze. Her hands flew to her chest, clutching the torn edges, her cheeks flaming with humiliation. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't comprehend the cruelty of the act. Margaret's voice, low and sharp, cut through the haze. "I will not have trash like you seducing my son." Amara's knees trembled. She wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, that she had done nothing wrong. But the words lodged in her throat, strangled by fear and shame. Margaret's fingers dug into the fabric again, yanking it wider until the pristine white uniform lay in tatters at Amara's feet. The maid stood exposed, not fully, but enough to strip her of dignity, enough to make her feel naked under the weight of judgment. And then, footsteps, heavy, measured, approaching fast. Margaret stiffened, her hands still clutching the torn fabric. Amara turned, her breath hitching in her chest. Ethan stood in the doorway, and everything changed. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his sharp jaw tightening as his eyes darted between his mother and the maid. The sight before him was surreal. His mother, the epitome of elegance and control, gripping the tattered remains of Amara's uniform like a trophy of conquest. And Amara, trembling, clutching the torn fabric against her chest, eyes glistening with humiliation. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grand clock on the wall, each second dragging like an eternity. Amara wished she could disappear. Every inch of her burned with shame. She could feel his gaze on her, Ethan, the one person who had shown her kindness in this house. Now he was seeing her like this, stripped of dignity, standing exposed under the cruel glow of the chandelier. Her heart pounded in her ears, each beat a frantic plea for escape. Margaret was the first to break the silence. "Ethan," she said smoothly, as if nothing was amiss, as if she wasn't clutching shredded fabric in her manicured hands. "I was just handling a situation." Her voice was calm, but her eyes glimmered with a dangerous mixture of defiance and control. She believed she could twist this, bend reality to her will, as she always had. Ethan didn't move. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. He didn't need to speak. His silence was a roar. Margaret stepped toward him, her heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. "This girl," she said, tilting her head toward Amara with a look of pure disdain, "was getting ideas. I will not allow someone like her to drag our name through the mud." Her words hung in the air, venomous and heavy. Amara flinched, but she said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat felt raw, as if the humiliation had scorched her voice away. Ethan's gaze shifted from his mother to Amara, and something darkened in his eyes. Not disgust, as Margaret expected, but something else. Something fierce. "Protective," Margaret continued, her voice sharpening. "I have tolerated her long enough. She is gone, tonight." Amara's breath caught. Gone? She thought of her siblings, their hungry faces, their hopes pinned on her meager income. If she lost this job, everything would crumble. Her mother's medicine, her brother's school fees. It would all vanish. Her knees weakened, and for the first time tears pricked her eyes. She swallowed hard, refusing to let them fall. She would not give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her break, but Margaret wasn't done. She stepped closer to Amara, her shadow swallowing the maid whole. "Pack your things," she hissed, her voice low enough for only Amara to hear. "And pray I don't ruin you beyond this house." The threat was clear. Margaret had power, connections that could make or break lives. One word from her, and Amara would never find work again. Ethan moved then, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "Enough." The single word cracked the air, deep and commanding. Margaret turned, her face hardening in shock. Ethan had never raised his voice to her, not once. But he wasn't looking at his mother anymore. His eyes were on Amara, softening, with something she couldn't name. He shrugged off his jacket and stepped toward her, draping it over her trembling shoulders. The fabric was warm, smelling faintly of his cologne, a sharp contrast to the chill of humiliation clinging to her skin. Amara's breath hitched. No one had ever shielded her before, not like this. Margaret's face flushed crimson. "Ethan!" she snapped. "What are you doing?" That girl," Ethan cut in, his voice like steel, "works for this family, and she deserves respect." Margaret stared at him, stunned into silence. For the first time in years, her son was defying her, publicly, unequivocally. But Ethan wasn't finished. He turned to Amara, his expression softening again. "Go to your room," he said gently. "I'll handle this." Amara hesitated, torn between gratitude and fear. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear from this nightmare. But something in his tone, steady, reassuring, gave her strength. She nodded, clutching the jacket tighter around her, and slipped out of the room, her steps quick and silent. As the door closed behind her, Margaret exploded. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, her composure shattering. Defending a maid? After what she's done? Ethan turned slowly, his gaze like ice. "And what exactly has she done, Mother? Worked herself to the bone to keep this house running? Kept her head down? While you treated her like dirt?" Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. She had never seen this side of him before. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but lethal. "You humiliated her. For what? Because she exists? Because you think kindness is weakness? Margaret's chest heaved with fury. You don't understand, she spat. People were talking. They noticed the way I what? Ethan snapped, cutting her off. The way I treat her like a human being? Is that what offends you? Margaret recoiled as if struck. But Ethan didn't stop. You think this family's name is built on perfection? It's built on decency. On respect. Two things you seem to have forgotten. Margaret's face twisted, but she said nothing. For the first time, her control was slipping. Ethan's voice softened, but his words were knives. If you can't treat the people who serve you with dignity, maybe you don't deserve the privilege you flaunt. Margaret's breath came in, sharp, shallow bursts. She had lost him. She could feel it. And the realization was a wound deeper than pride. Meanwhile, in her room, Amara sat on the edge of her narrow bed, Ethan's jacket still draped around her shoulders like a shield. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fabric, the events replaying in her mind like a cruel film. The ripping sound, the gasps, Margaret's voice dripping with venom. She had endured many indignities in her life, but this was different. This was a violation, a tearing not just of fabric, but of self. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. She pressed her fists to her eyes, willing the pain to fade, but it clung to her like a stain. Then a soft knock at the door. Her heart lurched. She froze, unsure whether to answer. Amara, came Ethan's voice, low and steady. It's me. She hesitated, then opened the door a crack. He stood there, his expression unreadable, a storm brewing behind his eyes. May I come in? She nodded, stepping aside. Ethan entered, closing the door gently behind him. The small room felt even smaller with him in it, his presence filling, the space like heat. I'm sorry, he said simply. 2 words, and yet they unraveled something inside her. No one had ever apologized for hurting her before, not like this. Before she could respond, he continued. What my mother did was unforgivable. I won't let her get away with it. Amara blinked, stunned. You don't have to. Yes, I do, he cut in, his voice firm. Because this isn't just about you. It's about what's right. There was something in his tone, something resolute, unyielding, that sent a shiver down her spine. I need you to trust me, he said. Amara searched his face, looking for cracks, for pretense. There were none. Only conviction. She nodded slowly, and in that moment, something shifted. Not just between them, but within the walls of the mansion. A battle line had been drawn, a line Margaret Sinclair would soon regret crossing. The next morning, whispers spread like wildfire. The staff moved through the mansion with hushed voices, their eyes wide with speculation. Something had happened, something big. They had heard the shouting, seen Ethan storming through the halls, his face thunderous. Margaret, however, was calm, or so she pretended. She sat at the breakfast table, her posture flawless, her smile brittle. She believed she could fix this, spin it, control it. She always could, until Ethan walked in. He wasn't alone. Amara followed a few steps behind, her head held high, clad in a fresh uniform that Ethan himself had insisted she wear. The jacket was gone, but the memory of its warmth lingered on her skin. The room stilled. Margaret's smile froze. Good morning, Ethan said coolly, taking his seat at the head of the table. A seat his father had once occupied, a seat that now symbolized power. Margaret's hands clenched under the tablecloth. Ethan, she began, her tone sugary sweet. I think we need to discuss. We will, he interrupted. In front of everyone. Her heart skipped. Everyone? Ethan gestured to the staff gathered nearby. Maids, butlers, cooks, all summoned at his request. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure what was about to unfold. Amara stood silently, her pulse thundering. She wanted to vanish, but something kept her rooted, something that felt like hope. Ethan's gaze swept the room, his voice calm but carrying steel. What happened last night will never happen again. Not in this house. Margaret's breath hitched. Ethan! No, he said sharply, his eyes locking on hers. You don't get to speak. Not after what you did. Gasps rippled through the staff. Never had anyone silenced Margaret Sinclair. Not like this. Ethan turned to Amara then, his voice softening. You have nothing to fear. Not from her, not from anyone. Amara's throat tightened. For the first time, someone was standing for her. Not as a savior, but as an equal. Margaret rose, fury flashing in her eyes. This is my house. Not anymore, Ethan said, his tone like a gavel striking. And with those words, the ground beneath Margaret's feet began to crumble. The storm had only begun. The breakfast room was silent, suffocating. The chandeliers glittered above, their brilliance mocking the darkness that had settled over the Sinclair family. Every eye in the room, maids, butlers, cooks, was fixed on the standoff between mother and son. Margaret Sinclair stood rigid, her perfectly tailored dress straining against the storm brewing inside her. Her son, once her pride, now her adversary, sat at the head of the table, a throne she had always believed was hers to control. For years she had ruled this house like an empress. Her word was law, her whims unquestioned. And now, in front of servants, her authority was being dismantled, brick by brick, by the very man she had raised to carry her legacy. Her voice, when it came, was sharp enough to cut glass. Ethan, you're making a spectacle of this family, of yourself, all for a maid? The venom in her tone dripped with disbelief, with contempt. It was meant to shame him, to snap him back into obedience. But Ethan didn't flinch. His calm was a weapon sharper than her rage. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on hers, unwavering. No, Mother, he said softly, dangerously. I'm making a statement. One this house should have made a long time ago. Margaret's lips curled in disdain. A statement? About what? That you've allowed a woman like her to compromise your judgment? The words hung heavy in the air, thick with prejudice. Amara felt them slice through her like knives, but she didn't move. She stood tall, silent, her face a mask of composure hiding the storm inside. Ethan's fists clenched under the table, but his voice remained steady. This isn't about her compromising anything. This is about you, and the rot you've let fester in this family. Gasps rippled among the staff. Never had anyone spoken to Margaret like this. Not her husband, not her closest friends, certainly not her son. Margaret's face reddened, her eyes narrowing to slits. How dare you? How dare I? Ethan's voice thundered now, echoing through the cavernous room. How dare you rip a woman's clothes in your own home? Humiliate her, degrade her. For what? For doing her job? For existing? Margaret faltered. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered in her eyes, but pride crushed it as quickly as it came. Margaret faltered. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered in her eyes, but pride crushed it as quickly as it came. You think I care what these people think of me? She spat, her arms sweeping toward the staff. They're nothing. She's nothing. And if you can't see that, then you're a fool. The words ignited something in Ethan, a fury long buried, a fire that had been smoldering beneath years of silence. He rose from his chair slowly, deliberately, like a storm gathering strength before it breaks. Nothing. His voice was low, now lethal. Is that what you call the people who keep this house standing? The ones who work while you sit on your throne, pretending you're a queen? Margaret recoiled as if struck. Ethan took a step forward, his shadow stretching across the polished floor, swallowing hers whole. You've spent your life building walls, Mother. Walls of money, of status, of fear. And now those walls are crumbling because you forgot one thing: respect. Margaret's breath came fast, shallow. For the first time, she looked uncertain, but she clung to her pride like a lifeline. You think you can run this house better than me? Fine. Take it. See how far you get when people laugh at you for defending. Her eyes flicked to Amara, venom dripping from the paws. Her. Ethan's jaw hardened. People can laugh all they want. I'd rather stand alone with integrity than sit at a table surrounded by cruelty. The room held its breath. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim, as if the mansion itself were listening. Then Ethan turned, not to his mother but to the staff. His voice, when it came, was clear, commanding, carrying the weight of finality. As of today, things change. No one in this house will be treated like dirt ever again. Not while I'm here. A murmur swept through the room. Shock, disbelief, hope. Margaret's face twisted in rage. You think you can strip me of authority in my own home? Ethan looked at her, his eyes like steel. It's not your home anymore, Mother. It's mine. The words struck like a thunderclap. Margaret staggered, the color draining from her face. What? What did you say? You heard me, Ethan said coldly. The house, the accounts, the businesses, everything Father left behind? They're all under my control now. You wanted power, Mother. You should have read the will. Margaret's knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wood. No, he wouldn't. He did, Ethan said. And I let. You play queen because I thought maybe you'd change. Maybe you'd learn compassion. But last night proved you never will. Tears glistened in Margaret's eyes, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage, of defeat. She had spent her life building an empire, only to watch it crumble in a single morning, brought down not by outsiders, but by her own blood. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his face inches from hers. I just did. The finality in his tone shattered something inside her. Her body swayed, her pride crumbling like dust. She sank into the nearest chair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan turned away without another glance. His gaze found Amara, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her knees steadied. Come with me, he said softly. She hesitated, glancing at Margaret, at the woman who had torn her down and now sat broken in the ruins of her own arrogance. For a brief moment, pity flickered in her chest, but only for a moment. Amara lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked toward Ethan. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, a dignity she thought she had lost forever. As they left the room together, whispers erupted among the staff. Not whispers of scandal, but of awe. The queen had fallen. The tyrant was dethroned. And justice for once had prevailed within these marble walls. Margaret sat motionless, her empire gone, her son's loyalty severed. Around her the echoes of her downfall whispered through the silent halls, a warning carved in gold and glass. Pride can build kingdoms, but compassion destroys empires of cruelty. The mansion, once a symbol of control and dominance, now felt different, lighter, freer. For years its walls had echoed with the sharp clicks of Margaret Sinclair's heels, the curt commands that sent staff scurrying like frightened mice, but now those echoes were gone. In their place was a quiet calm, a silence that spoke not of fear, but of relief. Amara walked through the hallways slowly, her steps measured, her breath steady. She could still feel the tremors of last night vibrating through her bones, the ripping of fabric, the weight of humiliation, the icy grip of fear. Yet now those memories no longer held power over her. They were scars, yes, but scars of survival. And survival was something she had mastered. When she entered the kitchen, the chatter ceased. All eyes turned to her, maids, cooks, housekeepers, people who had watched in horror as Margaret tore her dignity apart. For a heartbeat, the silence stretched taut. Then, a soft sound, a hand clapping. Another joined in, then another, until the kitchen was alive with applause, the kind that warms the coldest wounds. Amara froze, her throat tightening. She had never been applauded in her life, not for cleaning, not for serving, not for simply existing. Tears pricked her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of something brighter, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Margaret's fall upstairs, in the grand bedroom lined with gold-trimmed mirrors. Margaret Sinclair sat before her vanity, staring at her reflection. The woman who gazed back was unrecognizable. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, fell limp around her face. Her flawless makeup was smudged, her skin pale, her eyes hollow. For the first time in her life, Margaret Sinclair looked powerless. The ass. Phone on her dresser lay silent. No calls from friends offering sympathy, no messages from socialites eager for gossip. They had heard what happened, Ethan's public declaration, his words cutting like a blade through the polished veneer of her reputation. In their world, image was everything, and Margaret's had shattered into dust. She had built her life on control over people, over appearances, over narratives. But now, the narrative had slipped from her grasp, rewritten by the very person she thought she owned. Her son. As she sat there, the enormity of her loss pressed down on her. Not the mansion, not the wealth, those were material. What she mourned was power. And once lost, power was rarely regained. Margaret closed her eyes, her hands trembling. For the first time in decades, she felt fear, not of scandal, not of whispers, but of irrelevance. Because in a world where she had always been someone, she was now no one. Ethan's promise. Downstairs, Ethan stood in the library, a space that had once been his father's sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm patterns on the mahogany shelves. He had spent countless hours here as a boy, curled up with books while his parents argued in distant rooms. Back then, he had believed in the illusion of perfection, that money could shield them from ugliness. He knew better now. The door creaked softly, and he turned. Amara stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the golden light, her headscarf neat, her uniform pristine. But it wasn't the clothes that caught his breath. It was her eyes, eyes that had seen hell and still held grace. "Ethan," she said softly, almost hesitantly, "you asked me to trust you, and I did. But I can't stay here." His heart clenched. He had expected this. After everything, how could she feel safe in a place that had violated her so deeply? He crossed the room slowly, his steps unhurried, his gaze locked on hers. "You're right," he said finally. "You shouldn't stay, not because you're running, but because you deserve more than this house, more than her shadow." Amara blinked, startled by his words. "More?" "Yes," Ethan said, his voice steady, sure. "You've spent your life cleaning up other people's messes, Amara. It's time you build something of your own, and I want to help you do that." Her lips parted in protest, but he raised a hand. "Not out of pity, out of respect, out of gratitude. You reminded me what matters. Not money, not status, but humanity." The sincerity in his voice wrapped around her like a balm, soothing wounds still raw. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then, slowly, she nodded, a new beginning. 2 weeks later, the mansion was unrecognizable, not in structure but in spirit. The air, once thick with tension, now hummed with quiet joy. Staff moved freely, their laughter unguarded, their steps unhurried. The fear that had shackled them for years had dissolved like mist under sunlight. Ethan kept his promise. Wages were raised, working hours were shortened, healthcare was provided. For the first time, the people who kept the Sinclair empire standing felt seen, felt valued. And Amara? She was no longer among them, not because she was dismissed, but because she chose to leave. Ethan helped her secure a lease on a small apartment in the city, its walls bare but full of possibility. He connected her with a local community center where she could finish her education, something she had sacrificed years ago. And when she hesitated, when doubt crept in like a thief, he reminded her of her strength. "You survived her," he told her once, his voice like steel wrapped in silk. "There's nothing you can't survive." Amara believed him. Slowly, tentatively, but she did. Margaret's silence. As for Margaret, she remained in the mansion, but it was no longer hers. She lived like a ghost in the house she once ruled, her authority stripped, her influence gone. The staff no longer bowed, their smiles no longer carried fear. They walked past her with polite indifference, and that indifference cut deeper than hostility ever could. Her social circle vanished like smoke. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. The world that had once revolved around her had spun on without her, leaving her stranded in her own emptiness. Sometimes she heard laughter drifting from the kitchen, laughter that used to die at her approach. And in those moments, something sharp twisted in her chest, not regret, not yet. Pride still held her hostage, but loneliness, that she felt like a blade to the bone. One last look. The day Amara left the mansion for the last time, she paused at the grand staircase. Margaret stood at the top, her figure rigid, her face a mask of icy detachment. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. Two women bound by a moment of violence neither would forget. Margaret spoke first, her voice low, brittle. "You think you've won?" Amara's lips curved, not into a smile, but something quieter, stronger. "No," she said softly. "I think I'm free." She turned and walked out, the sunlight spilling over her like a blessing. Margaret watched, her go, her chest hollow, her empire reduced to ashes. The takeaway weeks turned into months. Margaret faded into obscurity, a relic of a world built on fear and control. Ethan thrived, not as the heir to a fortune, but as a man who chose integrity over inheritance. And Amara? She rose, not overnight, not without struggle, but with a resilience forged in fire. She completed her education, started a small business, and built a life anchored not in servitude, but in sovereignty. Her story spread, not as gossip, but as a whisper of hope. To every maid, every worker, every soul told they were nothing, it carried the same message. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. And once claimed, no one, not even the powerful, can take it away.